In July of 2020, the Kansas City Textile Works was a skeleton of its former self, groaning under the methodical assault of demolition crews. High above the factory floor, workmen began the final draining of a rooftop water tank, a vast metal cylinder that had once fed the industrial washers below. As the water receded, it exposed a thick, black sediment. It was not the rusted detritus of industry that held the foreman's gaze, but the unmistakable outline of a human form settled into the sludge. Tucked into the waistband of the tattered uniform was a tightly sealed plastic pouch, its contents miraculously preserved. At that moment, the case of Evelyn Watts, who vanished on October 22, 1992, was no longer a cold file. It was an active crime scene. October 22, 1992 was a day of routine. The air over Kansas City carried the first crisp promise of winter, and for Evelyn Watts, the day began as it always did. A single cup of black coffee, a neatly pressed work uniform, and a brief, loving note left for her sister on the kitchen counter. Evelyn was a woman defined by precision, a quality that made her an exemplary supervisor in the controlled chaos of the Kansas City Textile Works. Her world was one of batch codes, chemical compositions, and the unwavering standards she held for herself and her department. Her colleagues remembered her as quiet but unyielding, a woman who found a strange beauty in the order of things. During her lunch break, she would retreat to the quiet of her car, not to eat, but to work on her prized stamp collection. With tweezers and a magnifying glass, she would meticulously arrange the tiny perforated squares of paper, each a miniature window to a world far from the factory's humming machinery. It was her private, ordered universe. That afternoon, she logged a minor discrepancy in a batch of indigo dye. It was the kind of detail others might miss, a subtle inconsistency in the color saturation that troubled her. She made a note in her ledger, a neat, precise entry in a book filled with thousands of others. She was seen briefly speaking with the factory owner, Brent Hogan, who clapped her on the shoulder with his trademark charisma, thanking her for her eagle eye. It was a perfectly normal interaction. The 5 o'clock whistle blew, its shrill cry signaling the end of the shift. Evelyn tidied her workspace, aligning her pens and closing her ledgers. She exchanged pleasantries with a few co-workers on her way out, her steps unhurried, her expression calm. She walked into the sterile quiet of the women's locker room, the heavy door swinging shut behind her. The sounds of the factory floor faded, replaced by the echo of her footsteps on the concrete. The metallic click of her locker opening was the last sound anyone could ever attribute to her with any certainty. After that, there was only silence. A car left unclaimed in the employee parking lot. A purse and keys waiting patiently behind a locked door. A life full of quiet plans and meticulous habits that had simply and completely stopped. The rooftop became a sterile island under the July sun. Detective Macy Lynn of the Kansas City Cold Case Unit watched as the forensic team, meticulous in their white suits, painstakingly documented the contents of the industrial sarcophagus. The sediment had created an anaerobic environment, preserving not just bone, but fragments of the dark blue work uniform Evelyn Watts had been wearing. The recovery was slow, methodical, a life reduced to a grid search. The initial report landed on Lynn's desk 48 hours later. It was a document of cold, hard facts. The remains were skeletal. There were no obvious signs of catastrophic trauma, no bullet fragments, no blade marks on the bone. But the hyoid bone in the neck was fractured, a classic indicator of strangulation, though the coroner noted it could not be definitively separated from post-mortem damage. Time and water had washed away the most obvious truths. But one object defied the decay: the stamp album. It had been sealed in 2 layers of thick industrial plastic, the kind used for packaging dyes on the factory floor. The seal was watertight, an act of deliberate, careful preservation. Inside, the pages were stiff, but largely intact. To the initial investigators, it was a tragic personal effect, a hobby she couldn't bear to part with even in her final moments. But to Macy Lynn, it was an anomaly. People facing a violent end don't stop to double-bag their stamp collections. This wasn't a spontaneous act. The killer didn't just dispose of a body, they entombed it. They placed it in a location that was both hidden in plain sight and functionally inaccessible. This raised the first critical questions, the ones that began to sketch the outline of a ghost. Who had the keys and the technical knowledge to access the rooftop water tank after hours, a place only maintenance personnel would ever go? Why was this album, this collection of paper and glue, sealed with the care one might afford to crown jewels? And then, under a forensic light source, a technician found the annotations. Faint pencil markings, nearly invisible to the naked eye, on the last few pages. They were not names or notes. They were strings of numbers and single letters. B.G.R. The crime scene was no longer just a water tank. It was a coded message, delivered 28 years too late. The cover-up had been immense, and the key to unraveling it lay somewhere in the pages of a silent, meticulous ledger. In the autumn of 1992, the investigation into Evelyn Watts' disappearance was an exercise in futility. It was an inquiry starved of oxygen from the start. With no body, no signs of a struggle, and no ransom note, the Kansas City Police Department classified it as a simple missing persons case. Case file KCMP 92-743 gathered dust almost as soon as it was opened. The official narrative, pushed gently but firmly by the lead detective, was that Evelyn, a quiet and lonely woman, had simply walked away from her life. This theory was a masterpiece of convenient misinterpretation. Her meticulous nature was painted as obsessive compulsion. Her quiet life was reframed as one of secret desperation. Her family's protests, their insistence that Evelyn would never abandon them without a word, were noted in the file as the predictable, emotional denials of a grieving family, not as a credible counter-argument. The police had a simple story, and in the absence of evidence to the contrary, they clung to it. Brent Hogan, the owner of the textile works, performed the role of the concerned employer with practiced ease. He offered a $5,000 reward for any information, a sum just large enough to seem generous, but not so large as to attract undue attention. He personally assured detectives that his factory was an open book, that his employees would cooperate fully. He was a rising star in the Kansas City business community, a charismatic figure whose word carried weight. No one thought to question the man who signed half the city's paychecks. The initial procedural work was catastrophically flawed. The women's locker room was never sealed. It was cleaned by the night crew less than 12 hours after Evelyn was last seen, erasing any potential trace evidence. Interviews with factory workers yielded nothing of substance. They were loyal to Hogan, wary of the police, and unwilling to speculate about a supervisor who, while respected, was not a close friend to any of them. They offered vague pleasantries and went back to work. The investigation withered. Without a body, without a motive, and facing a wall of polite but unhelpful silence, the case was unofficially shelved within 6 months. It became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered on the factory floor. But the silence that descended upon the case of Evelyn Watts was not a natural quiet. It was a carefully constructed vacuum, built from procedural neglect, corporate influence, and the collective desire to believe a simple lie over a terrifying truth. That silence was not an absence of evidence. It was a form of complicity, an unwritten agreement that allowed a body to dissolve in a water tank and a killer to become a city father. Detective Macy Lynn's team began by chasing ghosts. They tracked down the former employees of the Kansas City textile works, men and women now in their 70s and 80s, scattered across the Midwest. Their memories were like faded photographs, details blurred by the intervening decades. They remembered Evelyn Watts, of course, the quiet supervisor, the precise one. But their accounts of her final days were a fog of contradictions. One recalled her seeming anxious, Another insisted she was happier than ever. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes clouding over at the mention of the factory of Brent Hogan. Decades had passed, but the shadow of his influence remained. When the frail well of human memory ran dry, Lynn turned to a more reliable witness: the factory's archives. During the demolition, the police had impounded dozens of pallets of documents, a literal mountain of paper representing the factory's operational history. For weeks, Lynn's team waded through a sea of invoices, personnel files, production logs, and time cards. It was a painstaking archaeological dig through the bureaucracy of a dead company, searching for a single anomaly in a landscape of routine. The first breakthrough came not from an invoice, but from the stamp album itself. Lynn put a junior detective on the painstaking task of cross-referencing the faint numerical annotations with the production ledgers from 1992. After 3 days of staring at microfilm, he found it. The numbers scrawled next to a stamp from Uruguay matched the batch code for a run of indigo fabric produced on October 19th. Another set of numbers, next to a stamp from Poland, corresponded to a batch of crimson dye logged on October 20th. The album was not a random collection of hobbies. It was a secret, parallel ledger. Evelyn Watts was using her collection to document her work. This discovery gave their search a new, sharper focus. They weren't just looking for clues about a disappearance. They were looking for evidence of a crime Evelyn herself was investigating. They shifted their attention from personnel files to the more obscure operational records. Maintenance schedules, chemical supply orders, waste disposal manifests. It was here, buried deep in a dusty binder labeled Auxiliary Systems, that they found the incinerator log. The entries were mundane, chronicling the routine disposal of factory waste. But one entry, on the night of October 22, 1992, stood out. The time was logged at 10:37 p.m., more than 5 hours after the last shift had clocked out. The signature belonged to Sam Kowski, the head of maintenance. The reason cited was the emergency disposal of chemically contaminated fabric. It was a single line of ink on a yellowing page, a minor deviation in a factory's long history. But according to the production and quality control reports for that week, there were no documented chemical spills. There were no reports of contaminated materials needing disposal, not a single yard. The incinerator log became the investigation's Rosetta Stone. Suddenly, Sam Kowski, the former head of maintenance, was no longer a name on a staff roster. He was the prime suspect. The theory was clean, logical, and compelling. Kowski had the means, the access, and the opportunity. He was one of a handful of people with a key to the rooftop access ladder. The log entry for 10:37 p.m. placed him at the factory long after everyone else had gone home, performing an action for which there was no official justification. For Detective Lynn's team, the puzzle pieces seemed to be snapping into place. They began building a profile of the man. Digging into Kowski's 1992 financials, they quickly uncovered a history of gambling debts and high-interest loans from unofficial lenders. The motive solidified: theft. It was a common factory story. A trusted employee, squeezed by debt, starts skimming. Chemicals, high-grade fabrics, anything of value that could be sold on the side. Evelyn Watts, the supervisor whose entire job was to notice discrepancies, would have been the one person capable of exposing him. The confrontation was easy to imagine. She discovers his scheme, threatens to report him, and in a moment of desperate panic, he silences her forever. The narrative gained momentum. The team believed they were closing in on the ghost of Sam Kowski. They tracked his employment history after he left the textile works a few years later, his subsequent addresses, his minor run-ins with the law. Everything pointed to a man living on the margins, a life consistent with someone who had committed a crime of desperation and gotten away with it. The case against him was circumstantial, but it was strong. They were preparing to locate the now elderly Kowski, confident that a confrontation with the evidence would lead to a confession. The theory collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a computer processing newly digitized banking records from a defunct credit union. While searching for evidence of Kowski selling stolen goods, an analyst stumbled upon a deposit into his checking account. The date was October 21st, 1992, the day before Evelyn Watts disappeared. The amount was $6,200 paid in cash. It was the exact sum needed to clear his largest outstanding gambling marker. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation. On the night of the murder, Sam Kowski was not a desperate man on the verge of being exposed. He was solvent. The motive of a panicked thief evaporated. The $6,000 deposit wasn't the proceeds of a crime. It was a payment for a service. The entire case pivoted on that single transaction. Kowski wasn't the mastermind. He was the muscle, the hired help. And the investigation was no longer looking for a killer. They were looking for an employer. The $6,000 deposit reframed every piece of evidence. Macy Lynn looked back at the stamp album, no longer seeing it as a simple ledger, but as the meticulous documentation of a corporate crime. The numbers were batch codes. But what were the letters? B, G, R, blue, green, red. It was a guess, an intuitive leap based on the context of a textile factory. She dispatched the fabric remnants found with Evelyn's body back to the crime lab with a specific, urgent request. Test for anomalies in the chemical makeup of the dyes themselves, using every technology that hadn't existed in 1992. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The report was dense with the arcane language of mass spectrometry and gas chromatography, but its conclusion was brutally simple. The fabric samples contained significant traces of azo dyes, a class of synthetic colorants that were cheap, vibrant, and banned in the United States for industrial use due to their known carcinogenic properties. The specific compounds detected were consistent with dyes manufactured in the former Soviet bloc during the 1980s and 90s. They were illegal to import, illegal to use, and a fraction of the cost of their American-made counterparts. Suddenly, the last pages of Evelyn's stamp album blazed with meaning. The stamps from Eastern European countries were not a random part of her collection, they were markers. She was flagging the batches made with the illegal dyes, creating a coded record of Brent Hogan's criminal enterprise. The letter B, next to a Polish stamp, corresponded to a batch of fabric whose remnants now showed traces of a banned blue aniline dye. R, next to a stamp from East Germany, matched a red that was laced with carcinogenic benzidine. The album was not a hobby. It was an indictment. It was the case file for her own murder. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when an analyst, re-examining Brent Hogan's corporate financials, found the mechanism for the cover-up. A series of small, regular payments to a shell corporation based in Delaware, disguised as consulting fees. The same shell corporation that had funneled $6,200 into Sam Kowski's bank account on October 21st, 1992. The money trail was complete. Macy Lynn sat in her office, the disparate pieces of the case laid out before her. The lab report, the banking records, and the water-stained stamp album. For 28 years, Evelyn Watts had been silent. But now, she was speaking. Her meticulous, quiet dedication had reached across the decades. The scattered clues, the annotations, the deposit, the faint chemical traces on a scrap of cloth now formed a single terrifying and undeniable picture. She finally knew not just who had killed Evelyn Watts, but exactly why. Based on the confession of Sam Kowski and the irrefutable forensic evidence, the final hours of Evelyn Watts's life can be reconstructed with chilling clarity. The timeline begins not with violence, but with a quiet conversation. After the 5 o'clock whistle, Brent Hogan intercepted Evelyn in the empty hallway leading to the women's locker room. His charismatic mask was still in place, but his eyes held an unfamiliar hardness. He knew she had been documenting something. He had likely been warned by a loyalist on the factory floor that her questions were becoming more pointed, her scrutiny more intense. He cornered her between the rows of cold metal lockers. The air, thick with the smell of soap and disinfectant, became charged with a new tension. He didn't raise his voice. He offered her a promotion, a raise, anything to buy her silence and her loyalty. He appealed to their shared history at the factory. But Evelyn Watts was a woman of unshakable principle. She calmly informed him that she knew about the illegal dyes and that she intended to report her findings. In her hand, she lightly clutched her work bag, the stamp album nestled safely inside. That was the moment Hogan's carefully constructed world began to fracture. His persuasion curdled into threats. He demanded the evidence she had collected. When she refused, his panic and rage boiled over. His hands, the same hands that signed paychecks and shook the mayor's, closed around her throat. There was no prolonged struggle in the echoing silence of the locker room, just a gasp, a terrible finality, and the sound of a body slumping to the cold tile floor. Hogan's first call was to the one man he owned, Sam Kowski. The maintenance chief arrived within the hour, his face a mask of fear and grim obligation. It was Kowski who knew the factory's forgotten corners. It was he who suggested the rooftop water tank, a place no one ever inspected, a place where the chemical-rich water would accelerate the destruction of evidence. Together, under the cloak of darkness, they began their grim work. They carried her through the silent factory, a place that was her life's work, now the stage for her erasure. They ascended the maintenance ladder to the roof, the city lights of Kansas City glittering indifferently around them. The last step was an act of supreme, cold-blooded arrogance. Hogan took the stamp album from Evelyn's bag. He had Kowski fetch the industrial plastic and a heat sealer from the supply room. In a final, cruel act of editorializing, he sealed her life's work, her silent testament against him, and tucked it into the waistband of her uniform. They opened the heavy access hatch on the tank, revealing a circle of black, still water. Then, with a soft splash that was quickly absorbed by the industrial silence, they committed Evelyn Watts and her meticulously kept truth to the depths. Kowski then went down to the incinerator, burning her bag and shoes to create a false entry in the log, a piece of misdirection for any future inquiry. They had not just hidden a body, they had erased a life from the world, confident their secret was safe, suspended in the darkness, 50 feet above the factory floor. The arrest of Brent Hogan sent a seismic shock through Kansas City's elite. On a warm September evening, as he was accepting an award for philanthropy at a charity gala, two plainclothes detectives approached him. Detective Macy Lynn was one of them. The clinking of champagne glasses ceased as they escorted the 78-year-old titan of industry from the ballroom, his face a bewildered mask of indignation. The public image he had so carefully cultivated for 3 decades shattered in the glare of 100 smartphone cameras. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution, led by a determined assistant district attorney, laid out the case with methodical precision. The centerpiece of their argument was not a weapon or a bloody fingerprint, but a child's stamp album. One by one, forensic experts, chemists, and financial analysts took the stand, each adding a layer to the story of Hogan's greed and Evelyn's quiet courage. The defense painted Hogan as the victim of a vindictive, senile employee, Sam Kowski, and a young detective desperate to close a high-profile case. But they could not explain away the dyes, the money trail, or the annotations. Sam Kowski, frail and hooked to an oxygen tank, provided the trial's most damning testimony. In a quiet, halting voice, he recounted the events of that October night, his words stripping away the last vestiges of Hogan's carefully constructed persona. He spoke not for a reduced sentence, which his failing health made a moot point, but for the absolution of a conscience tormented for nearly 30 years. He died in a prison hospice 3 months after the trial concluded. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Brent Hogan guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, citing the crime's cold-blooded nature and the decades-long concealment, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Evelyn Watts' surviving family, the verdict was not a celebration. It was a somber acknowledgement, a final, painful chapter in a story that had stolen their sister. Legal justice had been served, but the wound, carved by decades of not knowing, could never fully heal. The truth had finally surfaced, but it had taken a lifetime. Today, the lot where the Kansas City Textile Works once stood is a public park. Manicured lawns have replaced the concrete factory floor, and the laughter of children has supplanted the drone of industrial machinery. There is no plaque, no memorial to mark what happened here. There is only a smooth, unbroken expanse of green grass where a 50-foot water tank once reached for the sky, a placid surface concealing the memory of a dark and terrible wait. Brent Hogan died of a heart attack 2 years into his life sentence, a quiet end in a sterile prison infirmary. His philanthropic legacy was erased, his name stripped from buildings and scholarships, his life's work reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris and cruelty. His was a kingdom built on a secret, and when that secret was exposed, the entire structure crumbled into dust. The stamp album, the silent witness that had spent 28 years in the dark, was returned to Evelyn Watts' surviving relatives. It is no longer a piece of evidence, but a family relic. It sits not as a reminder of her death, but as a testament to her life, a life of quiet integrity, of meticulous attention to the truth, a truth so powerful it could not be contained by steel or water or time. In the end, a powerful man's empire, built on charisma and influence, was dismantled by a quiet woman's ledger. A ledger of simple facts, of batch codes and colors that proved more durable than a lifetime of well-crafted lies. Evelyn Watts never raised her voice, but her final silent testimony echoed across 3 decades to find its audience and deliver its verdict. The 5 o'clock whistle no longer blows over this part of the city. The machines are gone, the workers have scattered, and the factory is a ghost. But the silence that has taken its place is different now. It is no longer the silence of a secret kept, but of a story told. It holds the weight of a truth that refused to be drowned. It rings.